Everything they say turns out to be a lie. Everything they say turns out to be a lie. Everything they say turns out to be a lie. Everything they say turns out to be a lie. I wonder why.
What has happened is that we have undergone a corporate coup d'etat, and it's over. They won. The major structural assaults carried out by the Bush administration have been embraced by the Obama administration, all of them. Whether it is the expansion of imperial war, drone attacks, the looting of the U.S. Treasury by Wall Street, most importantly, the assault on civil liberties. The assault on civil liberties under the Obama administration is worse than under the Bush administration. The radical interpretation of the AUMF to authorize the assassination of American citizens. The FISA Amendment Act, which retroactively makes legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of American citizens, and we know that all our personal information is stored out in supercomputers in Utah. The use of the Espionage Act, which Dan spoke about, to shut down whistleblowers. I have friends who do investigative journalism, and they will tell you they can't even get a government official to talk to them anymore on background for fear of going to jail. Anything that challenges the official narrative, anyone within the system of power with a conscience who rises up to expose war crimes committed by our government will no longer speak. And finally, the NDAA. And you have to ask why. Why is there steady assault, stripping away of our most cherished civil liberties? What's happening? And what's happening is that the corporate state, which is, to use a business term, harvesting the nation, stealing as much as fast as they can on the way down, knows that the combination of economic decline and climate change, and they're running scenarios, I can assure you, in the NSA and everywhere else. They know that eventually there will be blowback. Eventually people will respond. And they want the powers to, in essence, criminalize any form of dissent. And that's what this is about.
The stakes, I think, are very high because what our case comes down to is, are we going to have a civil justice system in the United States or a military justice system? And the civil justice system is something that's ingrained in the Constitution, and it was always very important in combating tyranny and building a democratic society. And what the NDAA is trying to impose is a system of military justice that allows the military to police the streets of America, to detain U.S. citizens, to detain residents in the United States, in military prisons. And I say that probably the most frightening aspect of the NDAA is that it allows for detention, quote, until the end of hostilities. We're now, by my count, day 4,163 of this war, which is an open-ended war against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and now it's defined as associated forces in the NDAA. And so this type of militarization of our justice system has occurred sometime in our history. And at the argument today, I pointed to the case of Korematsu, which had to do with the forced internment of Japanese Americans within the United States during World War II. And so we're trying to prevent a repeat of episodes like that.
We don't live in a police state now. We don't expect to leave this room and be rounded up into Black Mariahs on the way to prison for what we've said, and the day may come when that will be a very different matter. What we have is the complete infrastructure of a police state, both physically in terms of prisons, but in terms of computerless and GPS roundings where they will know they know exactly where we are at this point. There's a lot of dots on the map.
Well, they don't need it right now. But the moment they need it, they click the switch.
If they need it, they can click a switch. For years I've said one more 9/11, and who could say, right or left, that that's impossible. One more major 9/11, and Muslims and Middle Easterners will be in camps to a much greater extent than Japanese were. I think there was 110,000 then, and we had a lot more here. And some of us here will be in there. We're not there yet. There has been very little opposition, if any, in Congress to this, or the President. Both parties have done it, as he said.
With almost each passing year, the government keeps pressing the outer boundaries of who they can target. First it's Al-Qaeda, then it's, quote, associated forces. They're expert at making up these squishy terms like co-belligerents, and they keep expanding the target for the government to the point where now we're involved in military action in Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Niger. I mean, it's ever expanding, and that's how the law has been going too. First the outer reaches were at the Holder statute, the anti-terrorism statute, where it's material, and now the NDAA has gone to substantial support, which could be construed as journalism or writing, and so the progression is going in the wrong direction, and it's only if citizens fight back via protest or in litigation that we're going to stop this, because I see no effort by either party to stop this.
Who writes our legislation but corporate lobbyists? The security and surveillance state is the mechanism. Look, we have not far from here, a few blocks from here, a joint command center with the NYPD and Goldman Sachs. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs with the Occupy movement. And let me tell you that when the security came out, it was a mixed security of Goldman Sachs security and NYPD security. These corporations have created 70% of our, we have 16 intelligence agencies, and as Jeremy Scahill has pointed out, 70% of their work are outsourced to corporations. We have handed the capacity for the security and surveillance state to private corporations. We have created mercenary armies. And if you look at the collapse of empires throughout history, as Thucydides said, Athens became a tyrant abroad and then became a tyrant at home. Empires hollow out themselves out from the inside. They, by the way, destroy their cities first, which is what we are doing, or largely have done. And then they bring back the mechanisms of control, the brutal mechanisms of control from the outer reaches of empire internally into empire. So to say, well, if the NDAA passes, then and he's still assassinated, it deals with a different problem of the same configuration. They want the capacity to blow anybody away from the skies, terrorize them from the skies abroad, and now we are watching 160 local police, law enforcement agencies apply for drone permits. Everything they do there migrates back here. It's why you have Blackwater, renamed Z, renamed something else, I can't remember, running around New Orleans. And so we have to look at it in its totality as a whole.
I was a senior executive of the National Security Agency, and to my utter horror, I discovered within weeks of 9/11 that the National Security Agency, headed up at the time by Lieutenant General Michael V. Hayden, had entered into a secret agreement with the White House in which the White House had made NSA the executive agent for the tippy-top surveillance program, the so-called warrantless wiretapping program, the Stellar Wind program. I found that out, and I raised my concerns, alarms, within NSA. First week in October 2001, I had the most chilling of conversations with a senior attorney at NSA who made it unmistakably clear that NSA had become the executive agent for the White House. It was all legal. The White House had approved it, and you do not want to ask any more questions, Mr. Drake. Don't go there. I knew in that moment, that was my moment of truth, I knew in that moment that what I was an eyewitness to was a very subversion of our own Constitution. And I knew in that moment in that very moment that not only had the wheels come off a 23-year legal regime and the wheels had come off the Fourth Amendment in secret, that we were in an entirely new vehicle. This was not a constitutional form of government. This was an alien form of government. It was a secret government being run by executive rule. And everything that has happened since 9/11 has simply increased the power of that secret government. The Constitution for them is just a piece of paper. It's an inconvenient truth. It's not a grand experiment. We don't really have constitutional government in this country anymore. It is a figment of our imagination. It is hollowed out Constitution. So the NDAA takes it to the next level. Not only was I prosecuted and indicted, and at one point facing, as the original prosecutor said quite clearly during an interrogation session at a secret FBI facility in the greater DC area, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Drake, unless you start cooperating with us? We might let you off for 15 or 20 years, maybe. That's what's facing this country. I was charged on the Espionage Act. That's the most egregious thing you can charge an American with. I was behind several 8-balls when they indicted me, 5 counts under the Espionage Act. But this takes it to the next level. At least I had access and recourse to the judicial system, and in fact, a third branch of government stood up to the government during my sentencing hearing on July 15th, 2011. What we're seeing with the NDA is something that's even more sinister. What you're seeing since 9/11 is the executive branch is subverting the Constitution. They want to take the power under themselves. They're betting, they have to, betting on a compliant Congress, a complicit Congress, and a judiciary that's not going to stand up to them. So what they end up doing is they will force certain kinds of enabling act legislation to Congress to make legal. That's the ex post facto side that was once illegal. The FICE Amendments Act is certainly a case in point. The other thing they'll do is they will do signing statements, or they will secretly interpret the existing legislation that doesn't suit their needs in terms of the national security state. That's precisely what was done with the Patriot Act. Section 215, the secret interpretation, which many of the senators who are on the SISI know what that secret interpretation is as well. It's pretty darn clear what it is. If you're a subscriber, you have information in the business, it's not yours, you don't own it. The corporation owns it. And because the corporation owns it, guess what? They can provide it to the government for national security purposes, or the government has direct access to it. That's just one example. And the Patriot Act was passed in the fall of 2001. These are all enabling act legislation. They're designed to ensure the increasing reality of an imperial presidency. That's what it is.
The problem is that the corporate coup has seized our systems of information. So you have a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, that control what most Americans listen to and watch. And it's either celebrity entertainment or trivia, or on the quote-unquote news channels like Fox or MSNBC, they're propaganda outlets for systems of power. The NDAA case was never mentioned on MSNBC because it made Obama look bad. Never. It wasn't mentioned on Fox because it has bipartisan support.
You know, you got to realize that. The conservatives and liberals share a lot in common. The people, and the President Obama is wrong. He thinks he's going to alienate Republicans if he vetoes these types of laws. He's wrong. He'd get support from Republicans if he'd take these positions. They're not our enemies. The judges that Carl and I often do best with, frankly, are conservative judges because they have a great libertarian tradition. Liberals and conservatives have a lot in common. And that's what makes the country great, that we share common values. This division between them is artificial. The conservatives believe in civil liberties. They believe in free speech. The greatest supporter of free speech in the United States right now, who would you say it is? Scalia. Scalia. Give whoever that is a prize, because I can't see you. It's Justice Scalia. And if you're looking to protect free speech, you don't want to go with the liberals. You need Scalia first.
Now, I've covered disintegrating societies all around the world. I've covered popular movements, the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I was in Prague. I was in East Germany, the Palestinian uprisings. And it's always the ruling elite that determines the configuration of rebellion. And because the ruling elite has not responded rationally to what's happened. In fact, of course, things are getting worse through the fiscal cliff, the refusal to restore unemployment benefits, the utterly mendacious figures on unemployment, just lying through their teeth, erasing people from the rolls, or people who work 28 hours a week at Walmart or below the poverty line or employed, et cetera, et cetera. Something's going to happen. I've been in those situations where you feel it, you know it's coming. You never know what triggers it. You never know what that tipping point is. It's usually something utterly benign. You know, for weeks in Leipzig, in East Germany, Lutheran clergy and a few of their congregants would walk through the streets holding candles, and, you know, everybody laughed at them. And then suddenly 70,000 people showed up. And Erich Honecker, the dictator, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowd. And when that paratroop division got there, they didn't do it. And you know, the Stasi state was the most sophisticated security and surveillance state in the world until ours. And Honecker lasted another week in power. I think they're that weak. Internally, they know they're that corrupt. They know how decayed they are. You know, there is no population or group in this country that has a greater cognizance of how rotten this system is than the people who run it. The amendment we had that challenged Section 1021 was written by Dianne Feinstein, and that was a very inadequate amendment because all it said is that Americans have a right to trial. It left open the possibility that they could be seized under the NDAA and put before a military tribunal. This did pass the Senate, but it was under John McCain's leadership on the House Senate Committee to unify the bill, dropped. The entire amendment was dropped. I don't think that, I think part of the problem for those of us who care about our open society or what's left of it is that we have to recognize that the formal systems of power don't work. And they're not going to protect us.
Dan Ellsberg will tell you, you know, what the worry is when these statutes are held over your head. And this is why people cease to speak out. I mean, I am sure the government's not setting up massive internment camps for journalists and activists. But the very fact that these powers exist is what diminishes free speech and the commitment to free speech. And every time we have a law like this, that commitment is eroded further and further downward, and that's what we're fighting against.
You know, we enter into the grey area of whistleblowers and activist supporters, and I was wondering perhaps if Mr. Ellsberg could touch upon how your role historically as a whistleblower seems to relate to this case. Reading
Judge Forrest's opinion last night, which is well worth doing. I didn't read every word. I went through every word, there were 112 pages, and read a lot of it quite carefully because it was fascinating. And one thing that struck me very much was here is somebody actually taking the Constitution seriously and the rights seriously, as though they weren't just a piece of paper, but were really important to interpret and preserve. And it struck me that if Judge Forrest had been a judge, and there have only been a couple so far, who had addressed the law on which I was prosecuted, the so-called Espionage Act, 18 U.S.C. 793, paragraphs D and E, that she would almost certainly, I would think, find that unconstitutional and facially unconstitutional. And again, the same issues arise of breadth and vagueness in this case.
What they're attempting to do is legally justify what they're already doing. They have argued that under the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act, they have a right to assassinate American citizens. I have read that act innumerable times, and Bruce and Carl did, and none of us find that in the act. That is, to be generous, a radical interpretation of the AUMF. And so what they're seeking to do is legally justify, in the same way that you was attempting to legally justify torture, they're essentially looking for kind of legal cover. And so I think it's all connected. It's all a part of this very rapid descent into a frightening form of corporate totalitarianism. And that is just writ large across the landscape. The statute is so broad that any government official, and I can go back to my experience in Central America, could check that box off and name me as a member of this group, in which case, under this provision, it was immediately clear to me, as it was to Carl and Bruce, that if this was given legal weight, people like me could instantly be locked up and stripped of due process. What we're talking about is the capacity of the U.S. government to make you disappear.
I used to think if there's another 9/11, NSA will be turned on us, you know, like a pinball machine. Wrong. It didn't take another 9/11. One 9/11 was enough to do that. So we've got that. But the point being that we can use, and we must use, occasions like this now. The big question is what to do about it. People in this room essentially agree with Chris, agree with me, agree with him, but what to do? And we need creative thinking about it. I think any answer that just says more of the past, bigger demonstrations, more letters, can't be right. It's got to be imagination here.